Hello and welcome to Compliance Culture, the podcast where we explore what it really takes to embed compliance in practice, not just on paper. I'm Lucinda Carney, CEO of Actus, and each episode will be unpacking how organisations can move beyond tick box compliance to build a culture of genuine accountability, trust, and ethical behaviour. We'll be joined by experts and leaders who are making compliance meaningful, from consumer duty and SMCR to training, performance and leadership. So if you're looking to bridge the gap between rules and real-world behaviour, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. And this week, I'm actually doing a podcast that's going to go out on both our HR Uprising feed and our Compliance Culture feed, because it's absolutely something that sits in both parties' ballparks. And that's because I've got Sarah Hodgkin-Bates here, and she's the data protection and HR partner for Morgan Armstrong. And I guess before we go into what we're going to talk about, which I'm sure people will guess is the sort of overlap between HR and compliance, Sarah, perhaps tell us how you got to have a foot in both camps or that kind of experience.
Thanks, Lucinda. Well, I started off with the HR route and obviously got trained in that and understood how it fitted within a company. And one of my passions with that is actually creating a great company culture. And I've been doing that successfully for a company for a number of years. And then the company approached me and said, "We need a data protection officer. Would you be interested?" So I thought, well, I'm starting to get a bit bored with HR, so I'll have a look, and did the training to become a GDPR practitioner. And then I realised that actually the two disciplines go side by side, hand in glove, because if you get one of them right, that feeds into the other and vice versa. So that's why I kind of have a bit of a foot in both camps, if you like.
Absolutely. And this is something that some people, particularly some HR professionals, feel quite uncomfortable about. So having that kind of joint expert, and that's why this podcast episode, we're going to focus on how do you protect employee data? So having a culture of compliance around that. So I suppose in terms of that, Sarah, what does compliance look like when it comes down to our people's personal data?
Very briefly, compliance looks like treating an employee's personal data, which is any information that can identify a living individual, in a way that is legal, transparent. So you tell the employee what data you're using and why, and then you keep it securely. So use it in a secure system. So if you're using an HR app or online platform, you've got that set up securely, and you only let authorized individuals use that data.
So transparency, I guess, is one of the key aspects to that. How do organisations make sure that they are being transparent or they're communicating that?
Well, this is actually a really great way of setting your company's culture, because if you get your data protection right, you are creating a spirit of transparency and cooperation, and it tells your employees and any applicants that you might have that they're important and valued and that they'll be treated well by your company. So some companies get it absolutely right. They have a website privacy notice or a privacy policy that tells individuals that go to their website how their data will be used. And they'll also have a separate employee privacy notice that they give to all employees when they join. Other companies can forget one or the other, or they might not realise that they actually need both.
So that's kind of a common heads up, or maybe area where people overlook, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's quite interesting is in my experience, it quite often depends on the size of the company. So data protection actually applies to all companies regardless of size. And obviously, if you're a sole trader or you have 5 employees or less, you can get by with doing less than a much bigger company or even a company with 20 employees or 10. But it's really good practice to kind of get this stuff in place because it gives you a framework that builds confidence in your employees. And
And I
that
think, sorry,
confidence feeds into your culture.
and I think that point you made earlier about it's also applicants, so they might not be employees. That's a part of your brand, isn't it? Your employee brand.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's telling your applicants, hey, we really want you to come and work for us. We value you. We're letting you know how we're going to use your personal data because we accept that whilst we might legally have to use it in certain circumstances, so to report to HMRC, for example, for right to work checks, you still need to understand exactly how we're going to use your data and be confident that we're not going to use it for any other purpose.
So once you've kind of communicated, you've set up your principles and you've communicated it, and you're making sure you're communicating it appropriately to all parties. How do you decide who accesses that data or controls that data to sort of protect it in that way?
Well, a basic principle of data protection is to minimize access. So you would only give access to people that strictly need it for their job or role. So, for example, if we take payroll data, that should only be accessed by the individuals that are actually doing the payroll function and not the whole accounts team if you have multiple team members. Managers don't necessarily need access to payroll data, but they may need access to their team's holiday records or disciplinary records. Accounts wouldn't need access to disciplinary records. What you need to do from a data protection point of view is look at all the data you're holding on employees within your company and then decide which of your employees strictly needs to access and use that data.
So you kind of almost have to segment it. It's not treating it just simply that's employee data. It's what type of employee data and what's
That's exactly
appropriate
right.
for people's
Yeah.
people's role. A slight adjunct to this, I was thinking about some of our listeners will be individual HR consultants who might be providing a service for an HRIS service to their customers or something. How does this fit here? I appreciate they probably have got access because they're given rights, but how do you sort of control that, and what should they be aware of what their terms are in terms of their access, their sort of definition?
Yeah, so what you would or should do, let's take it from both sides of the coin. So if you're an HR practitioner going into a company, you need to have something, your terms and conditions or your agreement with the company that covers how you will be processing or using that company's employees' data. Okay, so the company and you as the practitioner need to agree exactly what data you will be accessing, how you will be using it, how you will be keeping it securely, and what happens to that data when your engagement with that company ends. And as the company appointing an HR practitioner, you need to make sure that you have what's called a processing agreement, which tells the practitioner, this is how we expect you to handle our employee data.
Yeah. So I've heard the terms data processor and data controller. How does that
Yeah.
fit into those scenarios?
Okay, so very simply, a data controller is the individual or company entity that decides how the personal data they hold will be used. Okay, so they are in control of that personal data. A processor is an individual or an entity that is appointed by a controller to process the controller's data. Processing is just a data protection term for use.
Got you.
because it covers collecting it, storing it, using it in whatever way you need to fulfill what your business is doing, and also storing and deleting it.
And I suppose, is that so? If we were thinking about, you go and work with organisations, and you probably often spot things that could be done better. So whether it's about having the right level of privacy statements for different types or access controls, what would you say are the sort of things to watch out for that organisations might be being a little bit sloppy unintentionally about in this area?
So I think there are a few things that organisations can do. I would encourage a review of, if you have an HR platform, have a review of exactly who has permissions to which parts of the platform. Make sure that staff only have access to the parts they need. Have a clear desk policy. So at the end of every day, make sure that everything is locked away if you're still using paper documents. This is a real big one. Password protect sensitive files and folders, so that, again, only authorised people can access things like right to work documents, which will have sensitive data in, because they might have passport information with photographs, they might have address information, bank details. All that kind of stuff is well worth having a review of, and it's what I see constantly.
And you mentioned sensitive data there. I think there's different definitions of types of sensitive data. Are there different levels of security? What do people need to know about sensitive data, and also linking into reporting, I guess, on things?
Yeah, so UK data protection legislation is laid down in the Data Protection Act 2018 and something called the UK GDPR. And what those legal frameworks say is that there are certain types of personal data that are classified as special category data. So it means that you need to take special care over them. And what they are, in a nutshell, is data that could, if it's handled incorrectly, could have an adverse effect on an individual's rights and freedoms. So if you're an HR professional, you'll understand that under the Equality Act 2010, there's 9 protected characteristics, such as gender, marital status, race, etc. So any personal data relating to those 9 protected characteristics are classed as special category data in data protection. So things where this impacts directly on data protection would be something like your gender pay gap reporting, because that is relating to gender. So the risks that you might face in your reporting is, although you're generally reporting anonymized data, there could be a risk of being able to identify an individual if nobody else within your company fits that reporting criteria. So you need to make sure that you keep the files that you use for your calculations securely, you password protect it, you limit access to only 1 or 2 individuals, and that you make sure that when you're reporting to your board, if you're big enough to be able to do that, that your report is designed also to limit people being able to identify individuals.
So that's quite onerous, I imagine. I mean, have organisations got that wrong? Have there been examples where it hasn't worked well in that sort of situation?
Well, the thing that's quite interesting about this whole data gap reporting is I tend to see companies that fall into 1 or 2 camps, I should say. There are companies that are very open. They publish their gender pay reporting to their employees. They get buy-in with it. And there are others who will keep it all completely confidential, and it's just under the radar. It's just something that they do to fulfill their legal obligations. I'm not saying that either way is right or wrong. Obviously, if you're open with your data and your reporting, it is a way of creating that positive, inclusive company culture. But the key thing is, if you are challenged by an employee, you must be able to give them an open and honest answer about how you're using that data and why you're using it. And if you put that in your employee privacy notice from the very beginning, it's all out in the open and the question shouldn't even arise. Or if it does arise, you just say, well, it's in your employee data protection policy, but this is how we use it.
And actually, that's an interesting point. I've heard of subject access requests, and I know that some people kind of live in fear of those happening. And I imagine that's to do with it, or is that something that might be linked where people reach out and say they want to have all of their data on them? What's your view on that, and why are they so feared, and what should organisations do about it? Is this all linked to what you put in privacy policy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in my experience, subject access requests, or I'm actually going to abbreviate it to SARs because it's a lot easier to say, they're usually raised because someone has a complaint or a grievance and they're looking to gather evidence or to create stress and hassle for the individual they know will have to, either they know who will have to carry it out. So, for example, I was advising a company where a manager was having a problem with an employee. The employee raised a subject access request, knowing full well that it was their manager that was going to have to fulfill it, and they wanted to create the maximum possible difficulty for the manager. Now, the problem with that is a subject access request has to be fulfilled by the company unless they can demonstrate that it's manifestly excessive. So it would take far too much time and effort to gather the data, or it's unfounded. If a company refuses a SAR on those grounds, they need to be prepared for the individual to complain to the governing body, the regulatory body, who are the Information Commissioner's Office or the ICO. The ICO will get involved and they'll make a ruling as to whether the company should comply with the SAR or not. So it's actually probably safer to go ahead and do it. There's a number of issues with a SAR. The first one is that a company might not always recognise that they've received this request because it could be written. Well, that's a dead giveaway. If someone says, I want to see all the data you hold on me, that's obviously a SAR. But it could be verbal, and it could also be done via a post on social media. That's equally valid.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So the key thing that a company needs to do is have a clear procedure in place for how you will deal with a SAR when you get one. Know where all your employee or applicant data is held so that you can quickly retrieve it and deal with it straight away. You've got 1 month to reply to a SAR after you've satisfied yourself as to the identity of the person making it. And I would say crack on with it straight away, because it always takes longer than you think to do it, because you haven't just got to gather the data, you've also got to analyze it. So you've got to tell the person requesting it what you're holding, why you're holding it, the legal basis you have for holding it, and how long you will hold it for. And the thing about it is, if you get a SAR, don't immediately think you've done something wrong. It could come out of the blue, but be as open and honest as you can. If you're tempted to suppress information, don't, because this could backfire, especially if the employee knows that you've got more data on them than you've released. And that doesn't show your company in a very good light. It shows that you're secretive. It shows that you're not open with your employees. So if you answer as completely as you can with copies of the data and a proper report telling them why you're using it, that will reflect, again, your culture of openness and transparency that you're trying to show.
Without going into too much depth, I can definitely see how someone could create mischief, if you like, something like that. So it's not the thing about it, which sounds really tricky, or I think what I've understood a bit like maybe preparing for tribunals being very, very time consuming, is that I'm assuming it's not just the fact you can press a button on your HRIS system and it'll give you all the data you've got. Are they expecting, sort of, let's say are they expecting stuff that the line manager has written in their notebook, or are they looking for everything? Is that what you're expected to provide?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So employees or people making the SAR will be expecting to have absolutely everything on them, including the notes made in the manager's handbook. But actually, the ICO is quite clear on this, that handwritten records in people's notebooks would not generally need to be provided as part of a SAR because it would be quite difficult to gather that information. So the ICO says that actually, if holding stuff in paper records is going to be completely onerous to try and track down, you don't need to provide it. But you would be expected to not just look at your HR system, you would be expected to look at your email system because you'd be able to do a search on that. You'd be expected to look at your payroll system. If you've got any kind of other system or spreadsheet to record information, you'd be expected to produce that. But what you don't have to do or mustn't do when you provide an individual's personal data is if there is other information in there that identifies another individual, then you must redact it. So you must remove it.
Right.
So you only provide information on that individual. So that's how you can kind of flex it. The other thing you can do is you can go back to the individual and say, well, you've been an employee with us for 20 years. This is going to take a horrendous amount of time. Can you give us some search terms or a time frame that you want us to search?
Yeah.
So, for example, if you've got a long-term employee, they've been with you 20 years, you're having a capability problem with them that's been going on for the last 2 years, the employee, when you ask them to restrict it, might say, well, go back 3 years. Yeah, so what they're actually looking for is everything that relates to their capability issue.
Yeah. Makes sense. So you can sort of push back. You can go back and ask them to be more selective. I mean, can you also, when you're doing that search, and we will move on. I feel like we could do a whole podcast on this topic.
Yeah.
But when you're doing that search and of the emails, for example, I mean, they have access to. You're going to search. They're going to some of the emails they should already be able to see. So you shouldn't have to report on that, really, should you? It's more the stuff that's been when they've been talked about. I is my impression of what they're after.
Yeah, that's right. Well, again, you see, it all comes down to restricting the search terms because any email that an employee sends that is just to an external contractor agreeing works or to a client recording or something or responding to a query, that doesn't necessarily fall into the definition of a SAR because the only thing that bit of personal information that might be in there is the individual's name and a work email address. So the way you would get around that as a company is you would say, during the course of your employment, you have exchanged such and such a number of emails that we have on our system. These have been reviewed. They all relate to work. The only thing that's been released is your name. Therefore, we're not supplying them as part of this request.
Okay, that makes sense. So I suppose moving on, but I suppose it could be quite related. I know I assume this is GDPR because I know we've got a software platform and I remember us having to do lots on data retention and controlling it.
Yeah.
Interested to know about that, and I wonder whether that also links on from an SAR. So could somebody who is an ex-employee come back and say, provide me with the data that you were holding on me 3 years ago, and they've left 3 years ago. So how does that kind of link into data retention and what we should be doing in terms of balancing retaining it for the right reasons, but also deleting it when we shouldn't have it?
Yeah, well, this is another really interesting subject, because by law, employers have to keep employee records for a period of 7 years after an employee leaves. Okay. But that is for taxation and reporting purposes. Okay. The other legal limit to bear in mind is that an employee has 3 months from the date they leave to raise a tribunal claim.
Right.
So if they make a subject access request within that first 3 months, you would probably have all the information on them that you could possibly think of that they would be entitled to receive. And you couldn't rely on the fact that, well, they're only gathering it to get a claim. You couldn't necessarily rely on that to not provide them with that information. So some of the things that you can do to help yourself is consider really what constitutes an employment record. Okay, so it is probably your right to work documents, it's your payroll records, it's potentially your holiday and sickness records, and you should keep those for 7 years after they leave and then delete them because there's no legal reason for you to keep them. Okay, but if you have an employee's timesheet says paper records, how long really do you need to keep those for? If you've got it stored electronically in your payroll, do you really need to keep anything after the financial year end or the audit's being completed? Answer, probably not. Again, another thing you might consider is disciplinary warnings. They're live on an employee's record for 6 or 12 months, depending on whether they're a first or a final. Once they have expired, do you actually delete them from an employee's record? Or do you just keep the fact that a warning was issued and no backup details? You can protect yourself against a SAR by not necessarily keeping that information. But it's a real business decision to weigh up, because you need to consider what might be produced in a tribunal claim. So my advice would be, don't delete anything for 3 months after an employee leaves, because you might need to rely on it in a tribunal.
But it's interesting though, so I get that, definitely that 3 months thing, but I'm also hearing that you're saying don't hold absolutely everything forever.
Absolutely.
Clean it up. And I'm thinking back to the old days when we started off, went into business, and things would have actually been in filing cabinets. Now, who was actually taking things physically off people's records? So you've got to have a process to make sure, it may be off your record. You're told it is after 6 or 12 months, but is it really? And that's interesting. And actually, if you are doing something like that, you need to make sure you're doing it consistently, that you've got a robust process, and then you can legitimately say, no, we just get rid of those after, when they're off your record, it's off your record. So if you get an SAR, it doesn't happen, or SAR, it doesn't happen. But yes, okay, it's like a minefield again. So you've mentioned sort of right to work checks and things like those are the sort of things that people might pull in as well in terms of that. Again, that sort of thing is a legal requirement. It's quite sensitive. Is there anything different that people should be doing with those, or have we covered that in the topics we've covered so far?
So again, it's sensitive. It's classed as special category data, because the ID photo would be classed as biometric data. So it falls under that. So it's exactly the same process. Store it securely, encrypt it, password control it. If you must, store it in a locked cabinet rather than scanning it and saving it to a secure place on your network. Make sure it's always locked. Only allow authorized staff to access it. And think also about only having maybe 1 or 2 people within your company who actually carry out these checks. make sure that you've got a clear procedure in how it will be gathered, used and stored. One thing that people forget about as well is emails might not necessarily be secure. So the emails that your company sends might not be encrypted. So if you know that is the case, then you need to be password protecting any files that you're emailing to other individuals.
Yeah, that's a common one, isn't it? There's so many things there in terms of levels of security of email. So one final sort of topical one, which is maybe a bit left field of what we've been talking about, and I was curious about, is in some organisations, well, more commonly in the larger workplaces, you've got things like CCTV in there. What are the issues there, and or, the compliance issues that might throw up in the workplace?
Well, this is another one because employees are naturally very suspicious of it, especially if it's a system that you're deciding to bring in. They quote the Human Rights Act 1998 and say, it's an infringement of my civil liberties and my rights and freedoms. But what's quite interesting is that act can only be used against public bodies in UK courts and tribunals. But the principles of it are understood by employees who could use it to frighten companies into not implementing the system. So from a data protection point of view, again, it's classed as sensitive personal data because it's biometric, because you're capturing images. So it has to be handled with special care. Some of the things you can do as an employer, again, it's about communication. Tell them why you're using it, and it should be for security or safety and not employee monitoring to check up on what they're doing. You should have a very clear retention policy. So you should only be storing the images, usually 30 days is enough, and make sure that you limit who can see the footage or the images that have been captured. And another one as well, of course, is don't record sound if you don't need to. Sometimes an image is quite enough.
And I suppose so that those would be your top tips in terms of helping organisations use it because it definitely can be a real protection thing.
Absolutely.
So I suppose just drawing things together, are there any other general tips then that you'd have for people that think this is a bit of a minefield? Top tips as to where people should start if they really want to make sure they've got their compliance in order in relation to employee data.
I think my first recommendation would be sit down, look at all the data you hold on your employees. So personal data is any information that can identify a living individual. So it could be name, if it's very unusual. So my name is actually very unusual. Your name's quite unusual as well. But John Smith, there'll be thousands and thousands of John Smiths in the UK. So for us our name may be unique enough that it identifies us, but it might not be the case with other people. But if you put our names with our date of birth, or with our personal email address, or with our address, that then is identifying us as an individual. So sit down, write down where you have all this data stored, write down who is accessing it, review who's accessing it, tighten that up if you need to, so you're limiting it just to individuals who strictly need it, and make sure that you store it securely and delete it when you no longer need it. And data protection is actually a shed load more complicated than that, because there's all sorts of technicalities. But do you know what? You'll be going a good way down the process if that is all you end up doing.
It sounds like if you face up to it and get some good processes and practices and evaluate where you are right now, and then put processes in place, then you're going to be 80% of the way there.
Exactly.
Don't bury your head in the sand. Thank you, Sarah. It's been so interesting, and you clearly we could have gone on a number of those areas in more depth. If people want to reach out to you to connect with you, obviously you do consultancy, you can support them in that area. How would they get hold of you?
So you can drop me an email to Sarah, SARAH, at morgan-armstrong.com. or you can contact me via LinkedIn, where I have a profile there.
Brilliant. And we'll put those links in the show notes as well. So Sarah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks so much for joining me today on compliance culture. I hope you found our discussion was practical and insightful and helps us to see how we can all play a part in embedding genuine values-led compliance. If you'd like to know more about how Actus software can support organisations with performance accountability, consumer duty and SMCR compliance, why don't you visit us on actus.co.uk? The links are in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and share the podcast, and join me next time as we continue to explore what real compliance culture looks like in action.
When it's time to report to the board, clarity is everything. But all too often, key information is scattered amongst spreadsheets, emails and disparate systems. With Actus oversight, governance becomes effortless. Your key consumer duty metrics, status and outcomes are visualized in real-time dashboards, ready to share at the click of a button. Evidence accountability and progress without the admin headache. So when your board asks for proof, you already have it.
Why don't you visit us on actus.co.uk?